Did you know that the Alaskan tundra is releasing ancient carbon that has been frozen for over 10,000 years? And that scientists measuring methane burst from collapsing ground have recorded single craters large enough to swallow an entire apartment building? Did you know that beneath the surface of Alaska right now, there are military installations, secret Cold War infrastructure, and buried weapons systems that most Americans have never heard about, sitting frozen under permafrost that is now actively melting for the first time in recorded human history? Here's the thing nobody wants to say out loud. The Alaskan tundra is not some empty, frozen wasteland sitting quietly at the top of the map. It is one of the most consequential, most dangerous, and most rapidly changing pieces of land on planet Earth. And what is happening there right now should be front-page news every single day. So today, we are counting down 32 facts about the Alaskan tundra that will genuinely change the way you see this place. Some of these will feel unbelievable, some will make you angry, and a few will genuinely keep you up at night. Let us get into it. Fact number 32. The permafrost beneath Alaska is not just frozen dirt, it is a time capsule. When most people hear the word permafrost, they picture frozen soil, maybe some ice, nothing dramatic. But the reality is that Alaskan permafrost is a geological archive unlike anything else on Earth. Locked inside it are preserved plant matter, frozen animal carcasses, ancient pollen, trapped gases, and organic material that dates back hundreds of thousands of years. In some regions of Alaska, the permafrost extends downward more than 600 meters. That means frozen ground stretching deeper than the height of 2 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other. Scientists from the United States Geological Survey have used cores drilled from this permafrost to reconstruct climate conditions going back over 100,000 years. We are not talking about ice. We are talking about a biological and chemical record of the entire history of life in the Arctic. And right now, we are watching it thaw. Fact number 31. Alaska has more active volcanoes than the entire continental United States combined. Most people think of volcanic activity as something that happens in Hawaii or in distant parts of the Pacific. But Alaska sits directly on the Pacific Ring of Fire, and it hosts over 130 volcanoes that have shown activity in the last 10,000 years. Of those, roughly 50 are considered potentially active today. The Aleutian Arc, stretching southwest from the Alaskan Peninsula, is one of the most volcanically intense zones on the planet. Mount Redoubt erupted as recently as 2009, sending ash plumes 17 kilometers into the atmosphere and forcing flight diversions across a massive swath of North American airspace. What most people never consider is that a significant number of these volcanoes sit directly beneath the tundra, meaning the interaction between volcanic heat and frozen ground creates unstable terrain that scientists are still working to fully understand. Fact number 3030. In 1964, Alaska experienced the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in North American history. On the 27th of March, 1964, the Good Friday earthquake struck south-central Alaska with a magnitude of 9.2. To understand how powerful that is, consider that it released more energy than all the earthquakes recorded in the United States during the entire 20th century combined. The quake triggered tsunamis that killed people as far away as Crescent City, California. In the town of Valdez, entire city blocks dropped into the sea. In Anchorage, a neighborhood called Turnagain Heights experienced something called soil liquefaction, where the ground essentially behaved like liquid and houses slid down bluffs into the Cook Inlet. The death toll was 139 people, which sounds small only until you remember that Alaska's population in 1964 was less than 300,000. According to research compiled by the United States Geological Survey, this earthquake remains the second most powerful ever recorded in global history. Fact number 29. The Alaskan tundra is home to one of the world's largest intact ecosystems. The coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, often referred to by its initials, but which we will call the Arctic Refuge for the purposes of today's video, covers over 19 million acres of wilderness. That is roughly the size of the state of South Carolina, existing in an almost completely unaltered state. No roads, no permanent settlements, no industrial infrastructure. The refuge serves as calving ground for the porcupine caribou herd, which numbers around 218,000 animals. It is the migration corridor for 195 bird species. It shelters polar bears, muskoxen, wolves, wolverines, and Dall sheep. The indigenous Gwich'in people, who have lived in relationship with this land for over 20,000 years, consider the calving ground sacred. Understanding the scale of this place requires a different kind of thinking. It is not just a nature reserve. It is a functioning planetary system that has operated continuously since the last ice age. Fact number 28. The United States military has been operating in the Alaskan Tundra since World War II, and some of what they left behind is still there. During the Second World War, Alaska became the front line of American Pacific defense after Japan seized the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska in 1942, marking the only occupation of American soil by a foreign power during that conflict. The military response was enormous. Airfields, radar stations, ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, and command bunkers were built across the tundra at extraordinary speed. Many of these installations were abandoned after the war without proper cleanup. According to the United States Army Corps of Engineers, Alaska has over 2,100 contaminated military sites, many of them containing petroleum products, heavy metals, and in some cases, chemical agents that were tested or stored during the Cold War era. The thawing permafrost is now actively exposing some of this material, creating environmental hazards that were buried under the assumption that the ground would remain frozen forever. Fact number 27. Alaska contains a radar and missile defense system that is central to United States national security. Right now, today. Fort Greely, located roughly 160 kilometers southeast of Fairbanks, is home to the ground-based mid-course defense system, which is the primary missile defense architecture protecting the continental United States from intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from North Korea or any other adversarial nation. As of the mid-2020s, Fort Greely houses more than 60 ground-based interceptor missiles buried in silos across the tundra. The system has been operational since 2004. The strategic logic is simple. Alaska is the closest American territory to North Korea and to Russia, making it the ideal launch platform for both offensive missiles and defensive interceptors. When North Korea tests a missile, the radar systems tracking that launch are largely based in Alaska. The tundra, in other words, is not empty space. It is the shield of the American continent. Fact number 26. Alaska has an early warning radar network stretching across its northern coast that was built during the Cold War and has been continuously upgraded ever since. The Distant Early Warning Line, a chain of radar stations originally constructed between 1954 and 1957, stretched from Alaska across northern Canada to Greenland. Its purpose was to detect Soviet bomber aircraft approaching over the North Pole. At its peak, the Distant Early Warning System included over 50 radar stations, 12 of which sat on Alaskan soil. Though the original system was largely superseded by satellite technology in later decades, the radar infrastructure was never fully dismantled. Instead, it was upgraded into the North Warning System, which became operational in 1988 and continues to operate today. Here is what I find personally remarkable about this. We built an entire hidden civilization of radar towers and military outposts across one of the most remote and hostile landscapes on Earth, and most of the people whose safety it protected never knew it existed. Okay, before we keep going, here is a question for you watching right now. How many of these facts have already surprised you? Because we are not even halfway through the list. If you are finding this interesting, do yourself a favor and subscribe right now so you do not miss the next video. We have a lot more coming, and some of the facts ahead of us are even more extraordinary than what you have heard so far. Fact number 25. The Yukon Flats in Alaska represent one of the largest river delta systems in North America, and they are disappearing. The Yukon River, flowing over 3,000 kilometers from its headwaters in Canada to the Bering Sea, creates an immense wetland system in central Alaska, known as the Yukon Flats. This region contains over 40,000 lakes and ponds, forming one of the most important waterfowl nesting habitats in the entire world. Up to 2 million ducks breed in the Yukon Flats each summer, representing roughly 10% of North America's total duck population. But here is the problem. Over the past several decades, remote sensing studies published in environmental journals, including research supported by the United States Geological Survey, have shown that hundreds of these lakes are shrinking or disappearing entirely as permafrost thaws and water drains into newly opened channels in the ground. The ecosystem that produces 10% of North America's ducks is quietly vanishing, and almost nobody outside of the scientific community is paying attention. Fact number 24. Ancient viruses, some potentially still viable, are frozen in Alaskan permafrost. In 2022, researchers working in Siberian permafrost revived a virus that had been frozen for 48,500 years. The organism, which infected amoeba cells, was found in a layer of permafrost that had never previously thawed. Alaskan permafrost contains the same category of ancient biological material. Scientists have raised serious questions about what other microorganisms, some of which may predate modern human immune systems entirely, could become active as the Arctic warms. In 2016, an anthrax outbreak in Siberia killed a child and hospitalized dozens of people after warming conditions exposed the frozen carcass of a reindeer that had died from anthrax over 70 years earlier. The carcass thawed, the spores were released, and the outbreak began. Alaska has thousands of similarly frozen animal remains across its tundra, many of them from animals that died during disease outbreaks in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Fact number 23. The Brooks Range in northern Alaska is one of the most geologically dramatic and scientifically important mountain ranges on Earth. Stretching roughly 1,000 kilometers across northern Alaska from east to west, the Brooks Range represents the northernmost major mountain system in North America. Its peaks reach up to 2,736 meters at Mount Chamberlain. The range was largely unexplored by outsiders until the mid-20th century, and significant portions of it remain scientifically understudied today. Geologically, the Brooks Range formed through tectonic compression over roughly 120 million years, and its rock strata contain fossils dating back to the Cretaceous period. The range also serves as the continental divide for the Arctic watershed, meaning that all water north of the Brooks Range drains into the Arctic Ocean. What most people do not realize is that this mountain range forms the physical backbone of Alaska's entire northern landscape, and the glaciers retreating from its peaks are fundamentally restructuring the hydrology of everything downstream. Fact number 22. Alaska's oil pipeline is one of the great engineering achievements of the 20th century, and it is under serious threat right now. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, which I will call the pipeline for convenience throughout this section, stretches 1,288 kilometers from Prudhoe Bay on the Arctic coast south to the port of Valdez. It was constructed between 1974 and 1977 at a cost of approximately $8 billion, which in today's adjusted value represents something closer to $40 billion. The pipeline carries crude oil through some of the most seismically active, most geologically unstable terrain on the continent. It was engineered specifically to accommodate permafrost, with elevated sections that allow cold air to circulate beneath the pipe to keep the ground frozen. But as permafrost thaws and the ground shifts and settles unevenly in a process called thermokarst subsidence, the supports holding the pipeline in place are experiencing stresses they were not designed to handle. Engineers and researchers have noted that long-term permafrost degradation poses a genuine structural risk to the pipeline's integrity. Fact number 21. Project Chariot was a United States government plan to use nuclear bombs to blast a harbor out of the Alaskan coastline. In the late 1950s, the Atomic Energy Commission proposed using a series of thermonuclear explosions to excavate a deep-water harbor near the Inuit village of Point Hope on Alaska's northwest coast. The project, which was part of a broader nuclear civilian engineering program called Project Plowshare, called for detonating multiple hydrogen bombs with a combined yield far exceeding the bombs dropped on Japan, and doing so approximately 30 kilometers from an inhabited village. The local Inupiat people were not consulted. They were not warned. They were, in fact, actively kept ignorant of the plan during the initial planning stages. When word leaked and indigenous and scientific opposition mounted, the project was eventually canceled in 1962. But before the cancellation, the Atomic Energy Commission had already conducted soil and biota studies in the area, and some of those tests, later reviewed under the Freedom of Information process, involved introducing radioactive tracers into the local ecosystem to study how contamination would spread through the food chain. The people of Point Hope were not informed about those tests either. Fact number 20. The Alaskan tundra produces a biological phenomenon called a bloom event that can be seen from space. Every spring, as the Arctic sun returns after months of polar night, the tundra undergoes a transformation that happens with extraordinary speed. Within weeks, the landscape shifts from monochromatic white and gray to an explosion of green, gold, and purple, as grasses, sedges, mosses, lichens, and flowering plants push through the thawing surface. Satellite imagery captured by instruments, including those aboard National Aeronautics and Space Administration observation platforms, has shown that the timing of this greening event has shifted measurably over the past 4 decades, occurring earlier in the calendar year as temperatures rise. This shift has cascading consequences. Migratory birds that have evolved to arrive at specific times to coincide with peak food availability are finding mismatches between their arrival and the availability of insects and plant food. The Arctic tundra spring, which looks beautiful from orbit, is quietly becoming ecologically desynchronized. Fact number 19. Alaska's indigenous peoples have been sending detailed, consistent observations about tundra change to scientists for decades, and their knowledge has repeatedly proven accurate ahead of instrumental measurements. The Inupiat, Yupik, Athabaskan, Tlingit, Haida, and other Alaska Native peoples represent over 220 recognized tribal entities within the state. Communities living on the coast and across the tundra have been documenting changes in sea ice patterns, animal behavior, permafrost conditions, and weather systems through traditional ecological knowledge systems that span generations. I want to stop here for a moment and be honest with you. There is a long history in Western science of dismissing indigenous observations as anecdotal. But time and again, particularly regarding Arctic change, indigenous community reports have preceded instrumental scientific confirmation by years. When Inupiat hunters reported unusual seal behavior and thinning sea ice in areas where satellite data showed no significant change, subsequent studies confirmed the ice structure was indeed changing at depths the satellites could not initially resolve. These communities are the longest-running scientific observation network in the entire Arctic. Fact number 18. The largest earthquake swarm in Alaskan recorded history occurred beneath Mount Spur in 2023. Mount Spur is a stratovolcano located about 130 kilometers west of Anchorage, making it the closest potentially dangerous volcano to Alaska's largest city. In 2023, the volcano experienced an earthquake swarm of thousands of small-magnitude seismic events over a period of several months, which prompted the Alaska Volcano Observatory to elevate its monitoring protocols. While the swarm did not result in an eruption, it highlighted a persistent geological reality. Anchorage, a city of roughly 300,000 people, sits in close proximity to volcanic systems that have the capacity to deposit ash across the entire south-central region, shutting down aviation, contaminating water supplies, and damaging infrastructure. When Mount Spur's crater peak erupted in 1992, it deposited visible ashfall across Anchorage and disrupted operations at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, which is one of the busiest cargo transit hubs in the world. Fact number 17. The Alaskan tundra contains an estimated 30 billion tons of carbon, and it is beginning to release that carbon at an accelerating rate. For thousands of years, the cold temperatures of the Arctic tundra have allowed organic matter to accumulate without decomposing. Dead plants, animal remains, and other biological material have built up layer upon layer in the frozen ground. Scientists estimate that Alaskan and broader Arctic permafrost soils store approximately 1.5 trillion tons of organic carbon globally, with Alaska's share representing a substantial fraction of that total. As permafrost thaws, microbial activity increases, Bacteria begin decomposing the previously frozen organic matter and releasing carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Methane is particularly significant because it has a warming potential approximately 80 times greater than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. Measurements from monitoring stations across the Alaskan North Slope have shown increasing methane flux from tundra soils over the past 2 decades, and some researchers have warned that if warming continues, a feedback loop could develop in which Arctic warming releases stored carbon, which causes further warming, which releases more carbon. Fact number 16. Barrow, Alaska, now officially renamed Utqiagvik, is one of the northernmost permanently inhabited communities on Earth, and the changes its residents are experiencing are unlike anything in the modern American experience. Located at the very tip of the Alaskan North Slope, Utqiagvik sits at 71 degrees north latitude, placing it well above the Arctic Circle. The community of roughly 5,000 people, the majority Inupiat, lives through polar nights lasting 67 days in winter and midnight sun lasting 84 continuous days in summer. The sea ice that once formed reliably each autumn, providing a hunting platform for bowhead whales and a protective barrier against coastal storms, is now forming later, breaking up earlier, and in some years, not forming at full thickness at all. Coastal erosion in Utqiagvik and neighboring communities has accelerated dramatically, with some areas losing 3 to 4 meters of coastline per year. A number of Alaskan coastal villages are now facing the realistic prospect of becoming uninhabitable within the next few decades, representing what would be the first climate-driven internal displacement of American citizens in modern history. Fact number 15. The military's HARP research program in Alaska generated decades of conspiracy theories, but its actual science was arguably more interesting than the myths. The High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, which operated from a research facility near Gakona, Alaska, from 1993 until its management was transferred to the University of Alaska Fairbanks in 2015, was a Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and Air Force-funded initiative to study the ionosphere, which is the uppermost layer of Earth's atmosphere. The facility used high-frequency radio transmitters to temporarily heat small sections of the ionosphere and study how those alterations affected radio wave propagation, which has applications for long-range military communications and radar systems. Because the program was military-funded and relatively secretive in its early years, it became the subject of elaborate conspiracy theories involving weather control, earthquake induction, and mind control. The actual research was genuinely complex and fascinating, involving the physics of plasma interactions in the upper atmosphere. The program demonstrated real capabilities in generating very low-frequency radio waves that could theoretically communicate with submarines deep underwater, which was of significant defense interest. Fact number 14. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1897 transformed Alaska and the Yukon, and its ecological consequences are still visible in the landscape today. When gold was discovered in the Klondike region of the Yukon in 1896, the resulting rush brought over 100,000 people through Alaska on their way to the gold fields. Skagway, Dee, and other Alaskan gateway communities exploded from tiny settlements to boom towns almost overnight. The ecological impact was severe. Timber was stripped from hillsides for construction. Rivers were diverted and sluiced. Wildlife was hunted to near local extinction to feed the crowds. The trails cut through the tundra and mountain passes during this period created erosion scars that are still visible today, over 125 years later. In certain areas of the Alaskan interior, the hydraulic mining operations that followed the initial gold rush literally restructured river channels and hillside contours that have not yet returned to natural configurations. The gold rush is remembered as a romantic adventure. Its actual footprint on the landscape was anything but. Fact number 13. The Bering Land Bridge that connected Asia to North America and enabled human migration to the Americas was submerged not once, but potentially multiple times. During periods of maximum glaciation over the past several 100,000 years, sea levels dropped dramatically as water was locked in ice sheets, exposing a landmass connecting what is now Siberia to what is now Alaska. This land bridge, which scientists call Beringia, was not a narrow strip of ground, but a vast tundra plain stretching more than 1,600 kilometers from north to south. Archaeological and genetic research has established that the ancestors of all indigenous peoples of the Americas crossed this connection, with the primary migration events likely occurring between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago. But recent research has suggested the history of Beringia is more complex than a single crossing. Genetic studies of Native American populations indicate the ancestors of the first Americans may have lived on Beringia itself for thousands of years, in a kind of population waiting period before the ice corridors opened and allowed movement south. Alaska, in other words, is not just where people passed through. It is potentially where the founding population of two entire continents paused and transformed. Fact number 12. Lake Iliamna, Alaska's largest lake, contains a mystery that has persisted for over a century. Lake Iliamna, located in southwest Alaska, is the largest lake in the state and the third largest lake entirely within the United States, covering approximately 2,590 square kilometers. The lake is extraordinarily deep and poorly mapped in its lower sections. For well over 100 years, indigenous communities and non-indigenous observers alike have reported sightings of very large, unidentified creatures in the lake. Descriptions have consistently referred to large, slow-moving animals between 3 and 9 meters in length, sometimes described as resembling giant fish with blunt, rounded heads. The National Geographic Society funded an investigation in the 1970s that yielded inconclusive results. Various researchers have proposed that the reported animals could be Pacific sleeper sharks, which are known to penetrate far into freshwater systems and can reach lengths of up to 4.5 meters, or possibly sturgeon species. What is interesting from a scientific standpoint is not the mystery itself, but what it reveals about how poorly studied the deep water ecology of Alaska's largest lakes actually is. Fact number 11. Alaska is physically larger than Texas, California, and Montana combined, yet it has fewer kilometers of paved road than the state of New Hampshire. Alaska covers approximately 1,723,000 square kilometers, making it by far the largest state in the United States by land area. The entire road network of the state, including both paved and unpaved surfaces, amounts to roughly 24,000 kilometers. Of that total, only a fraction is paved. Hundreds of Alaskan communities have absolutely no road connection to the state highway network whatsoever. Bethel, the economic hub of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta and home to roughly 6,500 people, cannot be reached by road. Nome, Kotzebue, Dillingham, and dozens of other significant communities are fly-in or boat-in only. This means that the physical infrastructure connecting Alaska's population is primarily air transport, which comes with enormous cost implications. In many rural Alaskan villages, groceries, medicine, building materials, and fuel arrive exclusively by small aircraft or seasonal barge, contributing to some of the highest costs of living in the entire United States. This is where Alaska stops being strange and starts being haunting. Fact number 10. The Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989 remains one of the most consequential environmental disasters in American history, and portions of Prince William Sound still carry visible contamination today. On the 24th of March, 1989, the oil tanker Exxon Valdez ran aground on Bligh Reef in Prince William Sound, spilling approximately 41 million liters of crude oil into some of the most productive marine waters in North America. The spill coated over 2,000 kilometers of coastline, killed an estimated 250,000 seabirds, 3,000 sea otters, 300 harbor seals, 250 bald eagles, and 22 killer whales, along with billions of salmon and herring eggs. The economic devastation to Alaska Native communities and commercial fishing operations was severe, and in many cases permanent. Exxon Corporation, later merged with Mobil to become ExxonMobil, paid billions in cleanup costs and legal settlements, but the legal battles dragged through the courts for nearly 20 years before a final settlement was reached in 2008. What is rarely discussed today is that researchers sampling subsurface sediments in certain coves of Prince William Sound as recently as the mid-2010s found pockets of oil remaining from the original spill, preserved beneath the surface, still chemically similar to the original Valdez crude. Fact number 9. The aurora borealis above the Alaskan tundra is not just beautiful. It is evidence of a planetary defense system that protects all life on Earth. The northern lights, which are visible across much of Alaska for many months of the year, are produced when charged particles streaming from the sun collide with molecules in the upper atmosphere. These particles are deflected toward the poles by Earth's magnetic field, which acts as an invisible shield, preventing the solar wind from stripping away the atmosphere the way it has stripped away the atmosphere of Mars. The Alaskan sky, in this sense, is a literal display of the electromagnetic forces keeping the planet habitable. But this is not merely poetic. Researchers at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Geophysical Institute, which is one of the world's premier institutions for auroral science, have used Alaska's position directly beneath the auroral oval, which is the ring of maximum auroral activity circling the magnetic pole, to study space weather events that have direct implications for satellite communications, power grid stability, and the safety of astronauts. A severe geomagnetic storm striking Earth today could disable GPS networks, damage power transformers, and cost trillions of dollars globally. Alaska is the front row seat to that threat. Fact number 8. The native village of Newtok, Alaska, became the first community in the United States to officially relocate due to climate change, completing its move to a new site called Murtarvik in the early 2020s. Newtok, a Yupik community of roughly 350 residents located on the Ninglick River in western Alaska, had been experiencing catastrophic erosion and permafrost thaw for decades. The ground beneath the village was literally sinking and washing away. By the time relocation planning became official policy, some village infrastructure was already partially submerged during storm events. The bureaucratic process of securing funding and permits for relocation took over 15 years to complete, involving negotiations between the Tribal Council, the state of Alaska, and multiple federal agencies. The move to Murtarvik, a site on Nelson Island, began in earnest in the late 2010s and was substantially completed by the early 2020s. The story of Newtok is not an isolated one. The United States Army Corps of Engineers has identified over 30 additional Alaskan communities facing similar threats, with several rated as being in imminent danger. The logistics, costs, and human realities of relocating entire communities from sinking tundra represent a challenge that American public policy has barely begun to grapple with. Fact number 7. Alaska's Denali, formerly called Mount McKinley, is taller in terms of vertical rise from base to summit than Mount Everest. Denali stands 6,190 meters above sea level, making it the highest peak in North America and the third most prominent mountain on Earth after Everest and Aconcagua. But when you measure the vertical rise from the surrounding base-level terrain rather than from sea level, Denali's numbers become staggering. Because it rises from lowland terrain near sea level rather than from the already elevated Tibetan Plateau as Everest does, Denali's base-to-peak rise is approximately 5,500 meters. Everest's rise from its Tibetan base is approximately 3,500 meters. This means Denali represents a more extreme vertical ascent experience than any mountain on the planet from a climber's starting point perspective. The mountain also creates its own violent weather systems, with summit wind speeds recorded in excess of 300 kilometers per hour, and temperatures dropping to below 60 degrees Celsius. Denali is not just Alaska's crown. It is among the most challenging and deadly mountaineering objectives anywhere on Earth. Fact number 6. The Alaskan tundra hosts a Cold War relic known as White Alice, a network of tropospheric scatter communication towers, many of which still stand abandoned across the landscape. The White Alice communication system was a military communications network constructed across Alaska between 1956 and 1959 to provide reliable communications between military installations during the Cold War. Because conventional radio waves cannot follow the curvature of the Earth over long distances, The system used a technique called tropospheric scatter, bouncing radio signals off the lower atmosphere to achieve ranges of several hundred kilometers per link. At its peak, White Alice consisted of 31 sites connected by 71 communication links, forming a backbone that could transmit military command communications from Anchorage to the most remote radar stations on Alaska's coastline. The system was decommissioned in 1978 after satellite communications made it obsolete. But the massive concrete and steel antenna structures, some of them over 30 meters tall, were largely left in place because the cost of dismantling and removing them from remote tundra locations was prohibitive. Today, these structures stand across the Alaskan wilderness as enormous, largely forgotten monuments to the Cold War, slowly rusting and, in some cases, leaching contaminants into the surrounding soil. Fact number 5. The Alaskan tundra is disappearing at a measurable rate, with satellite data showing a net loss of tundra ecosystem to shrubification and forest encroachment. This is something I find genuinely haunting in a way I did not expect when I first started researching this video. The tundra is not just changing, it is being replaced. As temperatures rise, shrub species, including alder and various willow varieties, are expanding northward and upward into zones that were previously open tundra. This process, called shrubification, is transforming the visual character and ecological function of vast areas. Open tundra reflects solar energy back into space with relative efficiency. Shrubs and trees absorb more solar energy, creating a feedback effect that further accelerates local warming. Remote sensing studies published in peer-reviewed journals have documented measurable aerial expansion of shrub cover across Alaskan and Pan-Arctic tundra zones over the past 4 decades. The caribou, ptarmigan, and other species adapted specifically to open tundra conditions are finding their habitat contracting. The ecosystem that took 10,000 years to develop following the last ice age is being functionally rewired within a human lifetime. Fact number 4. Alaska's connection to Russia is closer than most Americans realize, and it remains one of the most geopolitically sensitive maritime boundaries in the world. The Diomede Islands sit in the middle of the Bering Strait. Little Diomede Island belongs to the United States. Big Diomede Island, located approximately 3.8 kilometers away, belongs to Russia. On a clear day, residents of Little Diomede, an Inupiat community of roughly 100 people, can see the Russian island with the naked eye. The international dateline runs between the two islands, meaning they are not only in different countries, but technically in different days. During winter, when sea ice forms across the Bering Strait, it was historically possible to walk between the two countries. The Cold War ended that practice, but the proximity of the two nations in this region shapes American military posturing to this day. Russian military aircraft regularly probe the outer boundary of the Alaskan Air Defense Identification Zone, prompting intercepts by United States Air Force fighters based at Elmendorf-Richardson and Eielson Air Force bases. The narrow stretch of water between Little Diomede and the Russian coast is arguably one of the most strategically watched pieces of ocean anywhere on Earth. Fact number 3. The scale of Alaska's wilderness is so extreme that it breaks ordinary human reference points entirely. I want you to try to hold this number in your mind. Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska covers 13,300,000 acres. That is larger than Switzerland. It is larger than 9 American states. It contains the largest assemblage of glaciers outside of the polar regions, including the Malaspina Glacier, which is larger than Rhode Island. The park has more land area than the combined footprint of the next 4 largest national parks in the United States. It contains peaks above 5,000 meters. It encompasses complete river drainages, entire mountain ranges, and coastal lowlands that have seen no permanent human settlement in recorded history. And here's the detail that I keep returning to. A significant portion of this park has never been systematically surveyed at ground level by scientists. Not because it is inaccessible in theory, but because it is so vast that the resources to cover it comprehensively have never existed. There are valleys in Wrangell St. Elias where no human being, to the best of scientific knowledge, has ever stood. In the 21st century, on American soil, fact number 2, The thawing permafrost of Alaska is releasing ancient methane from reservoirs that could constitute a runaway feedback mechanism with no known human intervention capable of stopping it. This is not a distant threat. This is not a scenario from a future century. Researchers from multiple institutions, including the United States Geological Survey and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, have detected increasing methane emissions from Alaskan permafrost over the past 2 decades. In the Yukon Flats and the North Slope, sensors have measured methane concentrations above thawing lakes and wetlands that are significantly elevated above background atmospheric levels. The particular concern is not just that permafrost stores organic carbon that will slowly decompose. It is that beneath some permafrost zones, there are ancient deposits of methane hydrates and concentrated gas pockets that formed during prior warm periods and were then sealed by ice. If thawing reaches those deeper deposits, the release could be sudden, large-scale, and irreversible on any human timescale. Some researchers have called this scenario, in which warming releases enough methane to dramatically accelerate further warming, a climate tipping point. No technology currently exists to meaningfully cap or sequester methane being released from vast, diffuse areas of open tundra. The scale of the potential problem simply exceeds any existing human engineering response. And that brings us to fact number 1, which takes us back to exactly where we started. Fact number 1. The Alaskan tundra is not empty, frozen, or passive. It is the most consequential landscape in the Western Hemisphere, right now, in real time. And the story it is telling has barely reached the people it will most affect. At the beginning of this video, I told you that what is happening in the Alaskan tundra should be front-page news every single day. And I meant every word of that. In a single landscape, you have the missile defense architecture protecting an entire continent. You have contaminated Cold War military sites leaching into thawing ground. You have indigenous communities watching their land disappear and relocating from American soil for the first time in the nation's modern history. You have an ancient carbon archive spanning hundreds of thousands of years beginning to unlock. You have a biological mystery in its deepest lakes. You have an aurora that proves Earth's magnetic field is the only reason life exists here at all. You have the ghost infrastructure of the Cold War rusting in the wilderness. You have the land bridge that produced the entire human population of 2 continents. You have a pipeline worth $40 billion sitting on ground that was not supposed to move. You have radar systems tracking missiles aimed at American cities. You have ancient viruses in the ice. You have mountains taller by any meaningful measure than Everest. You have the first American climate refugees. This is not an empty place. This is where the most important story of our time is being written, and the tundra does not care whether we are paying attention or not. The question I want to leave you with is this. If all 32 of these facts were happening in a densely populated region, would any of them be anything other than the top story on every news broadcast in the world? And if your answer to that is yes, then ask yourself, why the distance and the cold and the perceived emptiness of Alaska makes it easier for all of us to look away. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who you think needs to see it. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one, because we are going to be doing a lot more of them. And I would genuinely love to know in the comments, which of these 32 facts hit you the hardest? Which one did you already know, and which one completely blindsided you? I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves.